Then continuation of the taxonomy portion, the contributions of systematics to biology. A consideration of the contribution of systematics to other branches of biology and to mankind as a whole adds to an appreciation of the leaders in many fields of biology have acknowledged their dependence on taxonomy. Elton made his statement in ecology, which we have learned earlier. Then applied biology. The contribution of taxonomy to the applied science has been both direct and indirect. It relates to medicine, public health, agriculture, conservation, management of natural resources, etc. Taxonomy breakthroughs have always supplied the key to the solution of previously perplexing problems in economic entomology. The famous case of the epidemiology of malaria is a good example. The supposed vector in Europe, the malaria mosquito Anopheles maculipennis megan, was reported throughout the continent, and yet malaria was restricted to local district. Large amount of money were wasted because no one understood the connection between the distribution of mosquito and the malaria. Then, with the help of taxonomy studies summarized by Hackett in 1937 and Bates, finally provided the key to the situation. The maculipennis complex is found to consist of several sibling species with different habitat preferences and breeding habitats, only some of which are responsible for the transmission of malaria in a given area. This new information enabled control measures to be directed to the exact spots where they would be most active. With biological control of insect pests again conceiving increased attention and the determination of exact country of origin of insect pests and their total fauna of parasites and parasitoids is restored to the great importance it had prior to the short period when at least some applied entomologists thought that they could completely control insects with pesticides. Then Pemberton in 1941 cites an outstanding instance of the value of citations assembled for taxonomic study, and the solution of first task is control problem. Some 20 years ago, the fern weevil Cinergrine encounters became very destructive to Celera ferns in forbs, and to find the islands of Hawaii and control measures become necessary. Entomology literature failed to reveal its occurrence anywhere outside Hawaii, and greenhouses in Australia and Ireland. Other records, of course, didn't has to country of origin. However, while engaged on problems in Australia in 1921, Pemberton had the opportunity to examine the old private insect collection at Sydney, and among the beetle species was a single Cercaris fulvitaris bearing the date of collection and the name of the locality in Australia from which it was obtained, and provided the key to the solution of the problem. For research of the areas indicated on the label revealed a small population of the and better still a braconid parasite attacking the larvae. Collections made immediately for shipment to Hawaii, and the establishment of parasite is quickly followed by satisfactory control of the pest. The bone on a label attached to a single insect specimen in 1857 in Australia. This contributed directly to the successful biological control of the Hawaii 65 years later. Then systematics and theoretical biology. The service function of taxonomy are often stressed to such a degree that the importance of systematics to the conceptual structure of biology are overlooking population thinking. For instance, has come into biology through taxonomy, and indeed one of the two roots of population genetics in taxonomy. The problem of the multiplication of species solved by taxonomists, and they have made the greatest contribution for our understanding of the structure of species and the evolutionary concept of peripheral populations. It was taxonomists who continued to uphold the importance of natural selection at a time when the early Mendelian, through mutation, had eliminated the role of natural selection as evolutionary factor. Then, the task of the taxonomists. There is much uncertainty in the minds of some zoologists as to the function of a taxonomist. Some laboratory workers and ecologists limit its role to service. He should content himself with identifying material and devising keys. Beyond that, he should keep his collections in good order, describe new species, and have every specimen properly labeled. According to this view, systematics is a mere pigeonholing of specimens. In actuality, systematics is one of the major subdivisions of biology, broader in base than genetics or biochemistry. It includes not only the service functions of identifying and classifying, but the comparative study of all aspects of organisms as well as interpretation of the role of lower and higher taxa in the economy of nature and in evolutionary history. And it is a synthesis of many kinds of knowledge, theory, and method applied to all aspects of classification. The ultimate task of scientist systematics is not only to describe the diversity of the living world, but also to contribute to its understanding. The modern taxonomist is far more than the caretaker of the collection. He is a well-trained field naturalist who studies the ecology and the behavior of his species in their natural native environment. Most younger systematists have had a thorough training in various branches of biology, including genetics. This experience in both field and laboratory gives them an excellent background for more fundamental studies. The practice of classifying consists of two principal procedures, each in turn consists of two separate steps. Then the discrimination of entities. The systematic's first task is to sort that portion of the diversity of individuals which he encounters to easily recognizable and internally homogeneous groups and to find constant differences between such groups. Each such aggregate is a phenon. A phenon is not necessarily a population in the biological sense, but may also be either a biased sample from a population like males, juveniles, moths, etc., or else in the case of sibling species a mixture of several populations, and finally in the case of geographically heterogeneous material possibly a mixture of several subspecies. The second step is the assignment of phenom to species and lowest taxon routinely used in classification. In most zoological grouping, instances are known in which several phenom within a single biological species have been described and named as species. In certain groups, the species have not succeeded completely even today in matching the sexes in wasps, the castes in case of ants, or the generations in case of trematodes. For some groups, we have separate identification schemes for larvae and for adults. This should not be called biological classifications because these biologists classify species, while larvae and adults are merely different phenotypic expressions of the same genotype. As soon as the basic units are discriminated, it becomes necessary to supply identifying symbols or names to facilitate communication among zoologists. Universality and stability are among the two most important qualities of each such names, as in all other communication systems. The inventory of species, even this first task of the taxonomist, discrimination and description of species, become the most formidable and the greatest the increase in our knowledge. Linnaeus in 1758 recorded many species of animals. It must be remembered that all estimates or counts contain two types of error, which fortunately tend to cancel one another out. First, a lesser or major proportion of the existing species is still undescribed in all groups of animals. On the other hand, in the more poorly known groups, the so-called number of species is the number of recorded names. This include many synonyms and names of geographic races still listed as full species. Then estimates of the total number of living species, like including nematodes, mites, and protozoans, range as high as 5 or even 10 millions. And this fossil species has been estimated to be 50 or 100 times as high. Thus, only about 1 in 500 fossil species has so far been described, and one of a single group of protozoans, the Foraminifera. 28,000 species has been described by 1964. It is of considerable significance that one strikingly new type of still being discovered. Next major topic is the species category. So the 20 or more categories which the taxonomist uses in classification are of unequal value and of different significance. They fall in naturally into three groups, like the species category, categories for distinguishable populations within species, and categories for higher taxa, that is for grouping of species. And the species in a number of different ways occupies a unique position in the taxonomic hierarchy. The species problem. It seems to be one of man's most elementary urges to want to identify things and name them. Even the most primitive native people have names for kinds of birds, fishes, flowers, or trees. If only individuals existed and the diversity of nature were continuous, it would be difficult to sort them into groups and distinguish kinds. Fortunately, at least in the animal world, the diversity of nature is discontinuous, consisting in any local fauna of more or less well defined kinds of animals, which we call species. Around New York City, for instance, there are about 150 kinds of breeding birds. These are the species of the taxonomist. Primitive natives in the mountains of New Guinea will distinguish the same kinds of organisms as quite independently does the specialist in the big national museum. The concept of species seems so absurdly simple that it always comes as something of a shock to beginning taxonomists to learn how voluminous and seemingly endless the debate about the species problem has been. So, already there is now fair agreement on the species concept, although heterodox views are still vigorously defended. For recent summaries, Mayer and Simpson in 1961, four statements of the botanical point of view. C. Haslope Harrison. The species problem has been made to appear more difficult that it is by a confusion of the concepts underlying the terms phenon, taxa, and category. The working taxonomist sorts specimens into phenom and decides which of these are members of population, each of which belongs to a single taxon of the species category. To be able to undertake the ranking of taxa, taxonomist must have a clear concept of category species. If he defines it as a morphospecies in such a way that it coincides with the phenon, he may facilitate the task of sorting specimens, but his activity will result in species that biologically and hence scientifically meaningless. The objective of a scientifically sound concept of the species category is to facilitate the assembly of data into meaningful taxa on the species level. A short survey of history of species concepts will show how different the species taxa which one is forced to distinguish if one adopts different species concept. Then species concepts. Taxonomic literature reports innumerable species concepts by their philosophical basis. All these concepts fall into three groups. The first two have mainly historical significance but are still upheld by a few contemporary authors. Then, typological species concept. According to this concept, observed diversity of the universe reflects the existence of limited number of underlying universals or types. Individuals do stand in any species relation to one another, being merely expressions of the same type. Variation is the result of imperfect manifestations of the idea implicit in each species. This species concept, going back to the philosophies of Plato and Aristotle, was the species concept of Linnaeus and the followers. Since this philosophical tradition is sometimes referred to essentialism, the typological definition is also sometimes used in the essentialist species definition. For a discussion of essentialism, various attempts at a purely numerical or mathematical species definition are logical equivalents of this species concept. It must be emphasized that there is a complete difference between basing one species concept on morphology and using morphological evidence as inference for the application of biological species concept. In case of Simpson, two practical reasons exist for the now quite universal rejection of the typological species concept. Like individuals are frequently found in nature that are clearly conspecific with other individuals in spite of striking difference in structure owing to sexual dimorphism, age difference, polymorphism, and other forms of individual variation. Although often described originally as different species, they are deprived of their species status, regardless of the degree of morphological difference, as soon as they are found to be members of the same breeding population. Then different phenomena that belong to a single population cannot be considered different species. Then sublinked species differ hardly at all morphologically, yet are good biological species. Then degree of difference is not the decisive criterion in the ranking of taxa as species. Its own adherents are abandon the typological species concept whenever they discover that they have named as a separate species something that is nothing but a conspecific phenotype. At present, the typological species concept is still defended by some writers adhering to Thomistic philosophy. The normalistic species concept. The normalists, Occam and his followers, deny the existence of real universals. For them, only individuals exist, while species are man made abstractions. When they have to deal with the species, they treat it as an individual on a higher plane. The normalistic species concept was popular in France in the 18th century, Buffon in his early writings, and Lamarck, and has adherents to the present day. Bessie expressed this viewpoint particularly well. Like nature produces individuals and nothing more. Species has no actual existence in nature. They are mental concepts and nothing more. Species have been invented in order that we may refer to great numbers of individuals collectively. Any naturalist, whether a primitive native or a trained population genetist, know that it is simply not true. Species of animals are not human constructs, not are they types in the sense of Plato and Aristotle, but they are something for which there is no equivalent in the realm of inanimate objects. So, the biological species concept is the next topic. In the late 80th century, it began to be realized that either of the medieval species concepts discussed in the two preceding sections was applicable to biological species. An entirely new species concept began to emerge after about 1750. It is argued by statements made by Buffon in his later writings, Maran and Walsh, and many other naturalists and taxonomists of the 19th century. Jordan, however, was the first to clearly formulate the concept in all of its consequences. It combines elements of the typological and nominalistic concepts by stating that species have independent reality and are typified by the statistics of populations of individuals. It differs from both by stressing the population aspects and genetic cohesion of the species, and by pointing out that it relieves its reality from the historically evolved shared information content of its gene pool. As a result, the members of a species form a reproductive community. The individuals of a species of animals recognize each other and potential mates and seek each other for the purpose of reproduction. A multitude of devices ensures intraspecific reproduction in all organisms. The species is also an ecological unit which, regardless of the individuals composing it, interacts as a unit with other species with which it shares the environment. The species, finally, is a genetic unit consisting of a large intercommunicating gene pool, whereas the individual is merely a temporary vessel holding a small portion of the contents of the gene pool for a short period of time. These three properties raise the species above the typological interpretation of a class of objects. The species definition, which results from the theoretical species concept, is species are groups of interbreeding natural populations that are the protectively isolated from other such groups. The development of the biological concept of the species is one of the earliest manifestations of the emancipation of biology from an inappropriate philosophy based on the phenomena of inanimate nature. This species concept is called biological not because it deals with biological taxa, but because of definitions is biological. It utilizes criteria that are meaningless as far as the inanimate world is concerned. When encountering difficulties, it is important to focus on the basic biological meaning of a species. A species is a protective protected gene pool. It is a Mendelian population which has its own devices called isolating mechanisms which protect it against harmful gene flow from other gene pools. Genes of the same gene pool from harmonious combinations because they have become co-adapted by natural selection. Mixing of the genes of two different species leads to a high frequency of disharmonious gene combination. Mechanisms that prevent this are therefore favorable by selection. This makes it quite clear that the word species is biological is a rational term. A is a species in relation to B and C because it is reproductively isolated from them. It has its primary significance with respect to sympatric and synchronic populations, and these are precisely the situations where the applications of the concept faces the fewest difficulties or the non-dimensional species. The more distant two populations are in space and time, the more difficult it becomes to test their species status in relation to each other, but the more relevant biologically this also becomes. The biological species concept also solves the paradox caused by the conflict between the fixity of species of the naturalist and the fluidity of the species of the evolutionist. It was this conflict which made Linnaeus deny evolution and Darwin the reality of species. The biological species combines the discreteness of local species at a given time with an evolutionary potential for continuing change. The unique position of species in the hierarchy of taxonomic categories has been pointed out by many authors. Taxa of the species category can be delimiting against each other by operationally defined criteria like interbreeding versus non-interbreeding of populations. It is the only taxonomic category for which the boundaries between the taxa at that level is defined objectively. Then logicians do not fully understand that the terminology of class a number fails to bring out the complete difference between, on one hand, the relation of individuals to the species, and on the other hand, the species taxa to higher taxa. The statement that something is a member of a class has an entirely different meaning for an individual, which through this genotype is a member of a species, and the species taxon which is included in higher taxa. A category is not a class in the same sense as a higher taxon, but a designation of rank. Logicians do not appreciate that the higher and lower rank of taxa is relative, not an absolute property. One can compare taxa in a single phyletic line, but one cannot say that the genus is the same thing in birds, ammonites, bivalve mollusks, protozoans, and weevils, and that they will all equal. Again, the species is an exception because, at least in some sexual species, the species is an equivalent phenomenon in all groups of animals. Then, intraspecific categories designate groupings of populations within species. Normally, however, the species is the lowest category used in routine taxonomy. The higher categories are groupings of species in view of the key position of the species and the fact that in nature one encounters individuals and phaena. The assigning of individuals and phaena to species taxa is one of the key problems of taxonomy. Then, from phenon to taxon to category. A failure to understand the meaning of these three terms and their theoretical foundation has led taxonomists into much confusion. It has been the cause of most attacks on the biological species concept. When an author says, as a paleontologist, I cannot employ the biological species concept because I cannot test the reproductive isolation of fossils, he reveals his lack of understanding. What the taxonomist observes directly are individuals which he sorts into phaena. On the basis of certain biological concepts and information, such as the awareness of the possibility of sexual dimorphism, growth, alternation of generation, non-genic modification of the phenotype, etc., he assigns the phaena to populations, which in turn he classifies into taxa. The ranking of a taxon as subspecies, species, or genus by a taxonomist is based on inference drawn from the available data. This methodology of basing inference on evidence and its justification has been perceptively discussed. Evolutionary classification uses, for the most part, concepts and definitions for which the data are not directly observable. This is not a feature peculiarity of taxonomy. It is shared in greater or less degree by most of the inductive species. Here it is necessary again to emphasize the distinction between definitions and the evidence that the definition is met. We propose to define taxonomic categories in evolutionary and to largest extent phylogenetic terms, but to use evidence that is almost entirely non-phylogenetic when taken as individuals' observations. In spite of considerable confusion about this distinction, even among some taxonomists, it is really not particularly difficult to isocentric. The well-known example of monozygotic or identical twins is explanatory and is something more than an analogy. We define such twins as two individuals developed from one zygote. No one has ever seen this occur in humans, but we recognized when the definition is met by evidence of similarity sufficient to sustain the inference. The individuals in question are not twins because they are similar, but quite the contrary, are similar because they are twins. Precisely so, individuals do not belong to the same taxon because they are similar, but they are similar because they belong to the same taxon. Linnaeus was quite right when he said that the genus makes the characters, not vice versa, even though he did not know what makes the genus. This statement is a central element in evolutionary taxonomy, and the alternative clearly distinguishes it from non-evolutionary taxonomy. Another way to put the matter is to say that categories are defined in phylogenetic terms, but that taxa are defined somatic relationships that results from phylogeny and are evidence that the categorical definition is met. The reproductive isolation of a biological species, the protection of its collective gene pool against pollution by genes from other species, results in a discontinuity not only of the genotype of the species but also its morphology and other aspects of the phenotype produced by its genotype. This is the fact on which taxonomic practice is based. Reproductive isolation cannot, of course, be directly observed in samples of preserved specimens. However, it can be inferred on the basis of various types of evidence, as for instance, the presence of a discontinuity, a bridgeless gap between two correlated character complexes. In living species, of course, such inferences can be tested by observation and experiment. The crucial difference between the reasoning of the typologist and the adherents of the biological species concept is as follows. The typologist says there is a clear-cut morphological difference between samples A and B. Therefore, they are, by definition, two morphophases, that is, two species. Any list of synonyms can quickly reveal how often this physiology has led to the description of fauna as species. The biological taxonomist asks, is the morphological difference between samples A and B of the kind one would expect to find between two reproductively isolated populations, that is, between two biological species? In other words, he uses the amounts and kind of morphological difference only as an indication of reproductive isolation, only as evidence to draw an inference. This is a legitimate and reliable technique where the typologist would recognize phenom or morphospecies. The biologist will draw the right inference from largely morphological evidence, and his species are usually confined by subsequent researches. When competent taxonomic work based on morphological evidence is re-examined in the light of findings of behavior or biochemistry, it is usually confirmed in its entirety. It is not always realized that the classification of fauna is based on entirely different evidence than the classification of species. The classification of species is based on weighted similarity, evaluating all sets of comparative data, be they morphological, physiological, behavioral, or whatnot. The classification of fauna is based on their relation to the gene pool of the population to which they belong. Ultimately, it can establish only by breeding behavior. This in turn can be either observed in nature or studied experimentally. It does not matter whether one deals with strikingly different sexes in birds, insects, or marine invertebrates, or with larval forms, or alternating generations of parasites, breeding alone, or in the piercing together of group stages, will establish what phenomena together form a population. The experienced taxonomist knows what variation to expect within a biological species. No computer method has yet been found that would empirically assign phenomena to species. The taxonomist does this rapidly and with a high degree of precision on the basis of his accumulated knowledge of the biology of the species concerned. In this taxonomic operation, the classical methods still reign supreme because they are enormously faster than the numerical methods. Then, species names. The scientific name or binomen of a species consists of two words, the generic name and the specific name. The rules concerning the coining of species names and all other aspects of the nomenclature of such names are very important, which we will be learning later. Species names, to become available, must be accompanied by a subscription. Advice concerning the preparation of descriptions is given in a later chapter. So, difficulties in the amplification of the biological species concept. Then, the fact that difficulties sometimes arise when the biological species concept is applied to natural taxa does not mean that the concept as such is invalid. This was seen by Simpson and Mayer in 1963. Many generally accepted concepts face similar difficulties when they have to be applied in a particular situation or to a specific sample. The concept tree, for instance, is not invalidated by the existence of spreading junipers, dwarf willows, giant cacti, and strangler figs. One must make a clear distinction between a concept and its application to a particular case. The more ordinary problems of taxonomic discrimination at the species level, in particular the criteria for ranking a taxon as a species rather than a subspecies, will be dealt later. The three most serious difficulties in the application of biological species concept are those caused by the pertinent information those caused by uniparental reproduction, and those caused by evolutionary intermediacy. Then insufficient information. Individual variation in all of its forms often raises doubt as to whether a certain morphotype is a separate species or only a phenomenon within a variable population. Sexual dimorphism, age difference, polymorphism, and other such types of variation can be unmarked as individual variation through a study of life histories and through population analysis. This is dealt with more, and the neonatologist who normally works with preserved material is confronted by the same problem as the paleontologist who likewise must assign phenom or morphotypes of species. Then uniparental reproduction. In many organisms, systems of reproduction are found that are not based on the principle of an obligatory recombination of genetic materials between individuals prior to the formation of a new individual. Self-fertilization, parthenogenesis, pseudogamy, and vegetative reproduction, breeding or fission are some of these forms of uniparental reproduction. A population as defined in evolutionary biology is an interbreeding group. By definition, therefore, an asexual biological population is contradiction, even though asexual is not contradictory. The biological species concept, based on the presence or absence of interbreeding between populations, is therefore inappropriate for uniparentally reproducing organisms. How to resolve this dilemma has been discussed by Simpson and Meyer in 1963, attempting to define agamospecies or asexual species. Agamospecies or asexual species, with or without using the word population, have not been particularly successful. Fortunately, there are usually well-defined morphological discontinuities among kinds of uniparentally reproducing organisms. The discontinuities are apparently produced by natural selection among the various mutants which occur in the asexual clones. It is customary to utilize the existence of such discontinuities and the amount of morphological difference among them to delimit species among uniparentally reproducing types. Species recognition among asexual organisms is based not merely on analogy but also on the fact that each of the morphological entities separated by a gap other similar entities seems to occupy an ecological niche of its own. It plays its own evolutionary role in groups like the Bilanoid rotifers, all of which produced by parthenogenesis, where is evidence for a definite biological meaning to the recognized morphological species. The treatment of asexual entities that do not quantify as species is very important. Then examples are known in which a form that is distinct as a good species reproduced strictly parthenogenetically, and no biparental species is known from which it might have branched off. The nomenclatural recognition is justified in some cases.